Have you ever showed up somewhere that you just didn't belong? And I mean, you walk into a room of people and you're like, whoa, I don't fit in here. Maybe you always feel that way. I don't know. I feel that way a lot. But there's been a few occasions where I walk into somewhere and I'm like, this is a group or a community or something of people that I really am the outsider. And not only the outsider, but I'm the one that has to figure out how to be welcomed into that space. So a few weeks ago, Nathan and I showed up on 223rd Avenue or something like that, and walked and started talking to people at the homeless camp to say, hey, we'd like to stay for a few nights and, just sort of visit and get to know people and, experience with you and that sort of thing. And they're like, really? Why do you want to do this? And what's the purpose? And what are you going to do with it? And then what? And why? And a couple of people got it, and they were like, okay, sure. Come in, hang out, stay for a night, and we'll talk about the next night. And we stayed for a night, and then they said, okay, well, we'll talk about the next night. And as we're there, okay, we don't fit in. It just is plain and simple. Not only that, there's a huge amount of skepticism involved, right? So they're like, why are you here? Some people thought we were police. Some people thought that we were there for some sort of harm, that we were there to check, and figure out what they're doing wrong so that we can share it, so we can identify. There was a huge amount of skepticism. And then there's plain and simple, you're in our home, you're in our space, you're in our community, and you don't belong here. There was a range of emotions involved in that. But the short end was we did not belong. And that was pretty obvious to most. Although I think by the end of the days, people assumed that we belonged. Anyway, so I share that to say sometimes this idea of being welcomed is extremely important. And for most of us, being welcomed is not a task. It's not a chore. For most of us, we are the camp looking at somebody that doesn't fit in and trying to decide whether or not we let you fit in with us. Trying to decide whether or not our boundaries will expand far enough for you to be welcomed in. And so that makes it difficult for us to understand that story. It makes it difficult for us to understand this biblical concept of hospitality before we get to the passage and all of this. It makes it hard for us to get it because for the most part, Christians are the insiders. For the most part, Christians create the bubble around. We create the norms, and we define what they are and what they look like. What does it mean to look like a Christian? What does it mean to talk like? Do you sound like a Christian? Because some of the words you're using, you don't really sound like the kind of Christian I am. Are we the same kind of? These are the conversations that we often have internally, or sometimes externally. We have those conversations with others. Often, those are the conversations that we're having as we create the boundaries of our community, and as we decide what are we going to allow when someone steps into those boundaries, how unfit or not fit or outsider are we going to let? What is that going to look like? So the Bible spends a ton of time addressing this question, addressing the idea and the concept of hospitality. In fact, almost without fail, when God says, when God speaks or appears or presents to someone, God often begins with, I am the God of your fathers. I am, and begins to work through the lineage of people and events. Without fail, one of those events, the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the God who rescued you from a place of oppression, a place from being an outsider. And what's amazing from there is that journey forward. Many will tell you, I don't know, not that many, but many will tell you that the Bible, that God's story really begins with the Exodus story. And what happens from there is a journey through lands of what they are foreigners, they are outsiders, they are journeyers in places that they don't fit in. And it is painfully obvious every time they show up to a town, a place, a community that they don't fit in. And they rely on the hospitality, the compassion, the willingness to let people in every time they do that. So God often reminds us, God often reminded them, your life has depended on hospitality. Your purpose is to carry that hospitality forward. And it is a hugely important issue throughout the text. Insiders and outsiders, that's the way we live. That's the way we think, the way we don't know life without insiders and outsiders. We look across the border and we go, man, those Americans are nuts. Can you believe what they've elected? Can you believe what they've done? Blah, 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 right? We look across the water and we go, can you imagine living in this space? And then we continue this broadening or narrowing. So then Christians talk about Christianity and the Christian community and the Christian walk and Christian businesses and Christian organizations. But once you get inside that, you start talking about, well, this denomination or this non-denomination or this specific church. I grew up in the Churches of Christ. We had a very strong sense of identity and borders. And you know who was in and who was out. But some Churches of Christ go further and are able to define their borders literally within the building walls. And we're not just talking about like who's got it right. We're talking about like who's going to heaven kind of conversations. The walls of this room. Those are the kinds of conversations. We could identify our borders extremely well. This conversation about hospitality is about learning to let those borders be broken. We talk about an open door and not a screen door. We talk about coming in and going out into our community. The boundaries, the borders of our open door church community are intended to be broken. And we've tried. It's always an effort. We tried to create a space where you can come in and come out without those identifiers of, well, do you fit this, and this? Well, then you can come in. But you can only do this, right? We've tried to free ourselves of that kind of thinking. And the hospitality question of the Old Testament and then on into the New Testament of insiders and outsiders is specifically addressing this experience of walking into a community that you don't fit in. Knowing that every day somebody walks into your own community that feels like and experiences that they don't fit in. That's the reality of this conversation about hospitality. Kind of a weird place to start for Genesis 19, but we'll get there. As we move into the New Testament, one of the things I love about the Gospels is you begin to see roles reversed. You begin to see The people who thought they were insiders are actually becoming outsiders through the stories and teaching of Jesus. And the people that thought they were outsiders are actually being welcomed in as insiders, just as the nature of who Jesus is and who he welcomes and how he reaches people. So Genesis 19 begins the story of... Is anyone unfamiliar? How far back do we need to go? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah begins before Genesis 19, even though that's where we usually start. It begins when three beings of some sort come to Abraham, and Abraham runs to greet them, goes back, cooks them this amazing meal, welcomes them into his home, takes care of them, looks after them, and turns out to be angels of God. Maybe God is present in that. We're a little bit unclear of what this really means. Many will say that there were two angels and God present as the third being in that story. Two of them journey on to Sodom. And here's how this begins. Let's set the stage. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him, by him. No, for I have chosen him, that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." And the Lord said, "How great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how very grave their sin. I must go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." So outcry in the biblical usage has a very specific purpose. It has a specific meaning. Do you remember when God comes to Moses and says, "You need to go back to Egypt and you need to help free the people"? God says to him, "I have heard the cry of my people." Outcry is a cry of injustice. A cry, if we could frame it here, of inhospitality. A cry of suffering. Most of the time we read this passage and we go, "How great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah? How grave is their sin?" And we stop there. What does sin mean? What does it mean here? What happens next, right? But in the statement, he has heard the cry of this people. He has heard the outcry of suffering and injustice. And so the men turned from there and went toward Sodom. That's the frame of reference. That's where we're starting this story, is God heard the cry of suffering and injustice. And too often, we skip that and move right to these angels in chapter 19, which we'll do now that we've framed it for us. Okay, so what happens next? Okay, Abraham was like, "Well, what if you found like 50 people there?" And God was like, "Okay, fine. If there's 50 good people there, then I'll let it go." And he's like, "Well, what if it was like, 10 or 5? And apparently they can't get to a number that works. So the angels are going to go, and they're going to let Lot and his family survive this catastrophe. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." This is the right posture. It's the right place to be. It's the right thought going forward. He is welcoming them into his home. He is going to provide their needs for the night. He is going to protect them in what he knows is a hostile community. What he knows is an inhospitable community. They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." That's a euphemism for sexually exploit. Lot went out the door to the men, shut the door after him, and he said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." It gets really dark here. The kid's gone. It gets really dark here. And what he says is, take my daughters instead. But they're not after sex. They're not after pleasure. They are after exploitation. They are after oppression. The purpose is not sexual in nature. It is dominance in nature. And so this isn't going to do for them. Now, every time we talk about this, we get into gender problems. Immediately, we talk and we get into gender problems. There's a huge problem here, right? It's not okay for Lot to say, "Take my daughters instead." His daughters carry a financial value. This is, again, dark, depressing, not exciting, not fun. His daughters carry a financial value to them. When they marry, how does this work? Something like that. They're an asset. Unfortunately, in the culture, they're treated like an object and an asset. And in this scenario, he is offering that asset, which is, I don't know, some sort of attempt to protect his guests beyond what is expected of him. It is an attempt at some sort of hospitality toward his guests who have come under his roof. In fact, he even says to them, "Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. Please leave them be. They have come under my hospitality, under my efforts to care for them. They are under my hand." And the men are not okay with that. And they said, "No, give them to us." And then they turn on Lot. And they say, "This fellow came here as an alien," insiders and outsiders, "and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And they pressed hard against the man and came to the door. But the men inside reached their hand out and brought him back in. And they struck them with blindness. So this always gets turned from a conversation about hospitality, Abraham first showing these men hospitality, welcoming them, giving them dinner, caring for them, making sure they're in good shape. Lot then welcoming them into his community, but saying, please, please, please come stay with me because this is not a nice neighborhood. Giving them food, giving them some water to wash their feet, and welcoming them, giving them some rest. This is a story about hospitality. And somewhere along the way, we turned it into a story about sex. Now, I don't want to dig too far into that. What I want to do is focus on the hospitality piece. You see, when Jesus sent his disciples out, he says, go and preach and share the gospel, share the good news. Do you remember what he says next? He says, if anyone doesn't welcome you, let their fate be like the fate of Sodom. Now, that may just be a random use of reference to Sodom being destroyed in the next few sentences here. But more likely, Jesus is saying, if anyone practiced the inhospitality as did Sodom, if anyone refuses to welcome you as did Sodom, then let their fate be the same. Now, we have to add some words to make that work. To be fair, it could just be a random reference to the city destroyed. But likely, Jesus is saying, Jesus is relating, as do many other references, relating this story to hospitality and caring for people and welcoming them in, particularly when they are vulnerable, particularly when they are outsiders, particularly when they are foreigners and on the margins of your society. And he says, not these, they have come under the shelter of my roof. And it wasn't good enough. And so the men pressed harder. Now, over in Judges, we have the same story. A man and his, again, we're always in this gender conversation. A man and his concubine come through a town. They try to stay in the center of the square, and an old gentleman says, no, come and stay with me. They come in, but this time the old gentleman says, here, take his concubine. And they say yes. And the story gets really dark from there. That's Judges 17, if you want to read that. I'll stop there. You can also, this is a true story. You can also read that in the Brick Bible, which is a Lego reenactment of the Bible. Not really kid-friendly, even though it's Lego. Judges 17 is in the Brick Bible, if you'd rather see it depicted in Lego. So the question is, what do we do with these stories that have been used this way? What are we trying to take away? Now, we spend a huge amount of our time focused inwardly on what does faith look like, focused inwardly on the spiritual activity of an individual, the spiritual health, and what it means to pray and to be good and to do all of those things for ourselves. But one of the key points of the text is this notion of hospitality and welcoming people in. Sometimes there's risk involved in that. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes you risk kickback from your own community. You risk the danger of your own community coming to your door and say, get this guy out of here because he doesn't belong or they don't belong. Our call, our purpose in this, in following the story both of Sodom, but also following the story of God, working through piece by piece, saying injustice matters. Suffering matters. We are going to live in a way that alleviates injustice, alleviates suffering, and welcomes those who are on the edges. I walked into that homeless camp a complete outsider, and it felt like it. And some people would walk by and wouldn't even look us in the eye. And some people would walk by and want to chat for 30 minutes. At the front of the camp, I shared this a few weeks ago, at the front of the camp, there's a tent that sits empty. It is the guest room. It is the tent of hospitality. It is the space for them to say, you are in need, you can stay here. That's the call of our churches. I read about these amazing stories of churches offering asylum or space for aliens in the U.S. Not aliens, but foreigners that don't belong, that don't have paperwork. And these amazing stories of churches putting their nonprofit status on the line, churches putting their own building and their community's stake on the line to care for literal foreigner that needs true hospitality. This is what the church should look like. This is what the early church should look like, is caring for people that are in need, regardless of what they look like. And as a church, when we open those doors, anyone should be able to walk in. The flip side of that story is if someone from the homeless camp comes in here on a Sunday morning, they are immediately going to feel like an outsider, just like I did walking in there. And they will have to rely on each of you welcoming them like people of God, welcoming them as a child of God. That's what this is about. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And ultimately, that's the point of this story of Sodom and Gomorrah is here is a people that are disrespecting the basic human needs of an individual, exerting their power and their dominance over people in effort to control and win or something like that. So think this week, how do you take hospitality and live it out?